After graduation during the Second World War, former Wehrmacht and SS soldiers became ideal mercenaries. They had invaluable military experience and knew no other life than war. Many of them were unable to return to a peaceful working life, which made them in demand to participate in new conflicts. Especially for those who wanted to avoid responsibility for their actions, the path was obvious: the French Foreign Legion. Since its founding in the 1830s, the Foreign Legion has been a haven for people with a dark past. They did not ask for passports and did not delve into the biography, providing an opportunity to start a new life. After the war, the Legion became a refuge for hundreds, if not thousands, of former German soldiers. Some of them even participated in the Vietnam War, fighting on the side of France and then the United States. Formally, the participation of SS men was prohibited, especially from among Soviet citizens whom the Soviet Union demanded to be extradited. But in practice, many were accepted under the guise of representatives of other nationalities: Czechs, Poles, or Yugoslavs. Among such soldiers, there were even those who had previously fought on different sides of the barricades. For example, according to the memoirs of the Sergeant of the Foreign Legion, Claude-Yves Solange, two Russians served in his battalion: a former NKVD lieutenant and a Zugführer of the Cossack Cavalry Division of the SS. Despite their different backgrounds, both died in Vietnam during the storming of Fort Isabel, fighting side by side. After the end of World War II, France found itself in a difficult situation. Despite the victory, its influence on the world stage was weakened, and its colonial possessions, including in Indochina, were under threat. French Indochina, territories Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia have been the crown jewels of the empire since the 17th century, but World War II weakened France's control. While the country was fighting the German occupation, the national liberation movement led by Ho Chi Minh intensified in Vietnam. A mine. At first, the Vietnamese guerrillas fought against the Japanese invaders, but by 1945 their weapons were already directed against the French colonialists. In August 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared the country's independence. This was a wake-up call for France. The loss of Indochina could have pushed other colonies to revolt, threatening the destruction of the empire. Realizing that it would not be possible to maintain control without decisive action, France began an urgent mobilization. However, his own strength was not enough. It was then that the Wehrmacht and Waffen SS veterans came to the rescue. In 1946, France deployed its army and mercenaries to Indochina, hoping to quickly suppress the uprising. In the early years of the operation, French troops were successful. The Viet Minh militia were driven out of key settlements, and in 1947, Ho Chi Minh and other leaders of the uprising narrowly escaped capture. According to some reports, Wehrmacht veterans who served in the Foreign Legion participated in the tactical landing operation. However, these successes proved to be temporary. The guerrilla war dragged on. The French controlled large cities and military bases, but this did not allow them to break the resistance. Ho Chi Minh turned the Viet Minh into the leader of a national liberation movement backed by the people, and the people cannot be defeated. SS veterans who had experience of anti-partisan actions understood this better than others. The situation became more complicated in 1949, when the communists led by Mao Zedong won in China. China, and later the USSR, began to provide large-scale assistance to the Viet Minh with weapons and resources. The anti-partisan raids of the Foreign Legion did not bring results, and the brutal measures against local residents only strengthened support for the uprising. The war was turning into a stalemate, where military force was inferior to the people's will. In the early 1950s, General Henri Navarre, appointed commander of the French forces in Indochina, faced with a decline in morale among the soldiers of the Foreign Legion. According to his recollections, most mercenaries did not seek victory, glory, or valor. Their only goal was to serve the minimum term of their contract, get money, a new name, and a wiped past to start life with a clean slate. The legionnaires looked indifferently at the fate of the French campaign in Vietnam and the problems their replacements would face. Navarre was disappointed by the state of the army. The initiative has long been lost, and the actions of the French troops have been reduced to defending their own bases. Control over the country remained purely nominal, while the territory was actually controlled by the Viet Minh forces. In an attempt to turn the situation around, the French command developed a new strategic plan in 1953. His goal was to create a powerful fortified bridgehead with an airbase near the border with Laos. This fortified area was to become a base for attacks on the Viet Minh supply lines in North Vietnam and Laos. The French hoped to destroy the rebel lines and seize the initiative. The French command chose the Dien Bien Phu Valley as the site of the operation, where there was a convenient field airfield built by the Japanese during World War II. The seizure of the bridgehead began on November 20th, 1953, when 9,000 paratroopers landed in the Dien Bien Phu area in 3 days. According to historians, about 2,000 of them were former German soldiers. The Viet Minh forces were partially destroyed or overturned, and the remaining retreated into the jungle. The French managed to capture a strategically important territory. After that, large-scale preparations for defense began. The expansion of the runway, the construction of trenches and trenches, the installation of wire barriers and minefields. The fortifications were based on 7 forts named after women: Anne-Marie, Huguette, Beatrice, Claudine, Dominique, Gabrielle, and Isabelle. Additionally, reinforcements were delivered by aircraft, increasing the number of the French group to 15,000 people. Not only soldiers of the Foreign Legion were sent to the valley, but also colonial units formed from Algerian Arabs, Vietnamese, and Thai mercenaries. The French hoped to turn Dien Bien Phu into an impregnable fortress, capable of withstanding rebel attacks and becoming a springboard for an offensive. The Viet Minh gathered more than 50,000 soldiers to storm Dien Bien Phu, armed not only with small arms but also with a significant number of artillery and anti-aircraft guns, mostly Soviet-made. The ratio of artillery forces was 4-1 in favor of the Vietnamese. At the end of January 1954, the bridgehead was completely surrounded. Despite the lack of roads and communications, the Viet Minh managed to secure their advantage. Weapons, provisions, and ammunition were transported along trails through mountains and jungles, on shoulders, bicycles, boats, and sometimes trucks. Artillery and anti-aircraft guns were secretly deployed to positions in the mountains surrounding the valley. French intelligence underestimated the capabilities of the Vietnamese, considering such logistics impossible. The movements were camouflaged by green tunnels of intertwined branches and vines, which reliably hid the troops from aerial reconnaissance. On March 13, 1954, the full-scale assault on Dien Bien Phu began. The Vietnamese opened heavy artillery fire, covering the airfield and defensive positions. Planes trying to take off were immediately fired upon by anti-aircraft guns. It came as a shock to the French command. The defense, which had been highly hoped for, was under threat. Fort Beatrice was the first to fall. Despite attempts by the French to organize a counterattack using tanks and paratroopers, the defenses were breached and both sides suffered enormous losses. The next day, Fort Gabriel, defended by an Algerian battalion, was similarly captured. The Thai battalion defending Fort Anne-Marie turned out to be a weak link. The soldiers began to desert en masse. By March 17th, their remnants had finally abandoned their positions. Nevertheless, the remaining fortifications proved to be more stable. The effect of surprise was lost. Despite the constant shelling and the tightening of the encirclement, the mobile groups of the Foreign Legion continued to make daring counterattacks, destroying enemy artillery crews. The brutality of the war reached its peak. The legionnaires did not take prisoners, destroying everyone on the spot, and they themselves could not count on mercy from the Viet Minh. The last to fall was Fort Isabelle, which was rumored to be defended by a garrison of former Wehrmacht and Waffen SS soldiers. On the night of May 7th to 8th, 1954, the survivors tried to break out of the encirclement. Only 73 fighters managed to reach the French troops. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu was a turning point. Many historians call it the last battle of the Waffen SS. Years later, French President Charles de Gaulle warned the United States about the risks of the Vietnam War. We used the most experienced soldiers and notorious guerrilla killers there, but we were defeated anyway. It's obvious what he meant.